And thank you so much for inviting me to talk about my favorite topic, PFASs, and how to address them. And I'm going to talk from a regulator's perspective, but it was great to hear yesterday Jody's talk about how Whole Foods Market is tackling PFASs also as a class. And this is a really difficult topic because there are so many different kinds of PFASs. There's thousands of them, over 4,000, and they have a lot of uses. A recent paper found that they have over 200 uses, and food packaging is not the biggest one. You probably can't even see it on this graph. But it is one that has raised concern in recent years because of the higher likelihood of exposure and the potential for PFASs to migrate into food. And the exposure from PFASs, however, comes from a lot of other consumer products, and it's complex. It can come from direct contact with the product, direct migration from food packaging, but it can also come indirectly from the environment, from for instance, when the food packaging is composted, the PFASs do not degrade, and they can end up again in any produce or food grown in that soil. So there's a lot of different exposure pathways, very complex. And when, at least from the regulatory perspective, when you try to think about handling something of this magnitude, so many chemicals, so many uses, such complexity, it kind of feels a little like this. It's, can be really intimidating. So there've been a lot of different approaches to how to handle them, and single chemical approaches are probably the most common, but they're not that effective in this case because there's thousands of such chemicals. We've seen some mixture approaches where different PFASs are tackled together because of their interactions. In the EU, the REACH regulations tends to take an arrowhead approach, which deals with certain PFAS, perfluoroalkyl acids, like perfluorooctanoic acid, PFOA, and everything that degrades into it, all its precursors. But there's also the potential to take a class approach and really think about the entire universe of PFASs. So here in the US, these chemicals are authorized in food packaging by the US Food and Drug Administration, which regulates the use of all food contact materials. They have authorized 28, they have 28 food contact notifications for 17 distinct PFAS chemistries that come from 6 different manufacturers. And these are all shorter chain, what we call short chain PFASs, but there used to be others before, longer chains. They were phased out as of November 2016. In 2020, the FDA announced a 3-year voluntary phase out of certain short chain PFASs because it was concerned about the biopersistence and toxicity of one of the metabolites of an impurity in those products. And they found that it could persist for quite a while inside, potentially inside our bodies. And they were able to create a voluntary phase out. That's going to happen over the next 3 years. But that still leaves 13 food contact notifications for 6 PFASs. So it hasn't really addressed the entire class. So why take a class approach to PFAS regulation? Well, I'm going to tell you what we do in the Safer Consumer Products program. So we have a pretty unique approach where we look at list of lists. It's based on lists from 23 authoritative bodies. We call it our candidate chemicals list. And if we identify a consumer product that contains one or more of those candidate chemicals, we can regulate that consumer product chemical combination as a priority product. We can add that priority product to the California Code of Regulation, and then any manufacturer who sells a priority product in California has to go through a comprehensive alternatives analysis process to ask the questions of whether the chemical of concern is necessary in the product and whether there is a safer alternative. And based on the results of the alternative analysis, we can take a wide range of regulatory responses. Sometimes it may make sense to ban the product. Sometimes it may make sense to require labeling or certain engineering controls to reduce exposure. Or if there are no safer alternatives or other options, we can also require manufacturers to put aside some funding, a set of grants for green chemistry research. So it could be research done in academic labs or in commercial labs. And that's something that is designed to ensure that there are safer alternatives to these products and we're not moving to what could be considered a regrettable substitution, a chemical that could be just as bad or worse. So we have the entire class of PFASs on our candidate chemicals list as defined in this paper by Buck et al. From 2011, which was the very first paper that introduced this term, the terminology of per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And so if you're curious what that means, what's covered in that scope, you can go and check out this paper. It covers probably at least 4,700 chemicals. There's other newer definitions right now that cover even more chemicals. The US EPA has a database of PFASs that includes over 9,000 compounds. So, there's a lot of them out there, but we have under our regulatory scope, the ones that meet the Buck et al. Definition. So around 5,000, I would say. And when we identify a priority product, we take a narrative standard approach. So we don't do a risk assessment. We have to answer two questions or to show that two criteria are being met. And those criteria are that there must be potential exposures to a candidate chemical in the product, and that one or more of those exposures have the potential to contribute to or cause significant or widespread adverse impacts. And here's the interesting part. When you think about adverse impacts, we tend to think about toxicity, but adverse impacts can be caused by a lot of other properties of chemicals. For instance, think about chlorofluorocarbons, which were used in aerosols and refrigerants and ended up destroying the ozone layer. They were not toxic, but they did have a very significant impact on our health by leading to ozone destruction up in the stratosphere. So we know that there's other properties of chemicals that can lead to adverse impacts, and that's why the Safer Consumer Products regulations consider a wide range of impacts. And for the class of PFASs, these are the ones that we identified. So we have a set of hazard traits that we call exposure potential hazard traits. And for PFASs, we found environmental persistence. It's probably no surprise there. They're also known as forever chemicals. Mobility in the environment, some of them show that, some show bioaccumulation. And all the ones that have been studied showed lactational and transplacental transfer, meaning that they are transferred to the fetus and they're transferred to the baby after birth through breastfeeding. They also are known to have a range of toxicological hazard traits, and different PFASs have different toxicological hazard traits. Some have not been studied, but these are the general ones that have been found to date. So you can see it's quite a range. There's also a wide range of environmental hazard traits, including phytotoxicity, and a range of outcomes that could impact wildlife developmental, reproductive, and survival potential. But all PFASs have slightly different properties, but what's common across the class, at least as defined by Buck et al. 2011, is that either the chemicals themselves or their degradation, reaction, or metabolism products are highly persistent, hence the forever chemicals name. So one way or another, they tend to be related or degrade into these perfluoroalkyl acids, or PFAS, which are extremely difficult to degrade. They're very stable, and they can last potentially indefinitely or on geologic timescales in the environment. And persistence, especially high persistence like this, has become concern in the scientific thought in recent years. There have been a series of papers by Ian Cousins' group, and one of them in particular stood out for me. And they say that if a chemical is highly persistent, its continuous release will lead to continuously increasing contamination. and result in increasing probabilities of the occurrence of known and unknown effects. And so basically, we don't know all the potential adverse effects of the class of PFASs, but because they're so persistent, these effects that we don't yet know about can manifest in the future if we keep increasing their concentration of these chemicals in the environment, because they never go away, so they keep accumulating. So this property of persistence was also recognized by the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment here in California. OEHA wrote the Green Chemistry Hazard Traits regulations on which the Safer Consumer Product regulations are based. And they claim that persistence should be considered a hazard trait because it's an inherent property of a chemical in the environment that results in increased exposure to the chemical and consequently potential for health risks. So that's why it can appropriately be identified as a hazard trait. So based on this, we explain how we chose to, or why we chose to regulate PFAS as a class under the Safer Consumer Product regulations in this paper. If you're interested to read more about this, you can check out our paper in Environmental Health Perspectives. When it comes to food packaging as a product containing PFASs, we determined that there are potential exposures and there is a potential for significant or widespread adverse impact. And so we proposed to regulate plant fiber-based food packaging containing PFASs as a priority product. And at the same time, there's a parallel effort by our sister agency, CalRecycle, who deals with the end of life of consumer products. And they're proposing to require all state-owned and operated food service facilities to only use food service packaging that is reusable, recyclable, or compostable according to the definition that they have in their regulation. And they require that anything that is recyclable or compostable or that can meet that definition has to not contain PFASs, at least as measured in total fluorine. So the concentration of total fluorine in the packaging has to be below 100 parts per million. Now, the CalRecycle regulations are getting close to being finalized. However, we stopped our regulatory process because, hot off the press, the governor in California just signed a ban on the sale and distribution of all plant fiber-based food packaging with intentionally added PFASs. So the ban was signed just a couple of days ago, and it's going to become effective on January 1st, 2023. What's different in this ban is that it defines PFAS as a class of fluorinated organic chemicals containing at least one fully fluorinated carbon atom. So it's a broader definition. It contains anything that's intentionally added and also anything that's present at or above 100 parts per million. So even impurities, if they're present at more than 100 parts per million total organic fluorine, they would also be covered by this. It also requires labeling of cookware if it contains any candidate chemical in the handle or in any part of the cookware that comes into contact with food. So it's a very broad piece of legislation. There have been a lot of other legislation passed in other states, starting in 2018 with the state of Washington that banned food packaging with PFASs, provided that the Department of Ecology can identify safer alternatives. Maine followed in 2019. In 2020, New York also followed with a ban, but the difference was that they banned PFASs regardless of whether there were alternatives or not. And in 2021, we had the state of Vermont and Connecticut who again introduced broad bans that included food packaging. So there's a lot of movement and there's potentially others coming at the state level. So definitely a lot of change here. So you may notice that these laws are looking at total fluorine as an indication for the presence or absence of PFASs. So I want to end with talking a little bit about how we can tell if food packaging is PFAS-free. There are no methods to measure for all PFASs. What we do have are these total fluorine methods. This is really the only way to confirm the absence of any PFAS. So basically, if there's no fluorine in the sample, there's no PFAS, at least not at the levels that can be detected. But it's not specific to PFASs. So if you detect fluorine, it could also be potentially something else. So that's one challenge. But in that case, to verify that it's indeed a PFAS, you could also do targeted analysis. There's non-target analysis. Those are more difficult, more expensive, but they can confirm specific PFASs. They would definitely not be able to identify all PFASs, maybe not even the ones that are specifically added to that packaging. So I do think that they need to be done in conjunction with these total fluorine methods. So here are a few total fluorine methods that exist right now. They have, their challenges. Some are not commercially available, but there are options out there. So I'll leave you with this thought, as we're trying to move towards safer food packaging, we really need to think about the chemicals in there and make sure that they allow us to reach compostability and recyclability and keep this packaging out of the landfill. So it's really nice to talk to you today. If you want to follow up, here's my contact information, and thank you for your attention.